The entire estate fell silent. Not because dinner ended, but because someone did unthinkable. At the center of Hudson Valley Estate's dining room, beneath antique chandeliers, Lenora Vale, feared fiancée of Don Thatcher Varelli, deliberately dropped a silver cigarette case at the feet of Maribel Knox, maid hired only 2 weeks ago. It was a test. Everyone knew. They'd seen this before. Drop something valuable, watch them scramble, apologize with lowered eyes, trembling hands. Every employee for 5 years passed the test by cowering. But Maribel didn't cower. Calmly picked it up, handed it back directly to Lenora. No apology, no lowered eyes, no trembling, just quiet, unflinching respect. As if Lenora were a person, not a threat. The room froze. Lenora didn't react immediately, because no one had ever treated her like this. Staff exchanged shocked glances. Security tensed. And Thatcher, watching from the study doorway after finishing the business call, felt something shift. Fear that governed his household had just been challenged. Before we continue, like this video if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees credentials and titles. Share it with someone who needs to hear that courage doesn't require permission. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens when one temp worker sees the truth everyone else is paid to ignore. Now let's continue. The test. The entire Hudson Valley estate fell into silence. Not because the dinner service had ended, not because someone had dropped a plate or spilled wine, but because Lenora Vale had just done something that made every person in that dining room, from the sommelier to the security detail stationed at the doors, understand that someone was about to be destroyed. At the center of the private dining room, beneath the warm amber glow of antique chandeliers that had witnessed 3 generations of syndicate business, Lenora stood perfectly still. Her raven black hair fell straight down her back like a dark waterfall. Her pale skin seemed almost luminous in the candlelight, and her cold gray eyes were fixed on the new maid who'd been hired exactly 2 weeks ago. Maribel Knox stood 3 feet away, a silver coffee pot still in her hand, her warm brown skin, a stark contrast to the crisp white uniform all the household staff wore. Her thick coiled hair was pulled into a loose bun at the nape of her neck. She had soft features, a gentle face that might belong to a kindergarten teacher or a librarian, but her eyes held something that didn't quite match that softness. They held calm. Absolute, unshakable calm. And in this house, where fear governed every breath, that calm was dangerous. Lenora's silver cigarette case lay on the Persian rug between them. She dropped it deliberately. Everyone in the room knew she dropped it deliberately, because Lenora Vale never did anything by accident. She was a woman who measured every gesture, every word, every smile. And this particular gesture, dropping something valuable at a servant's feet, was a test she'd administered dozens of times over the past 5 years. The 50 guests seated at the long mahogany table had all gone quiet. Judges, politicians, business leaders who owed the Varelli syndicate favors in ways that could never be spoken aloud. They all watched with the slightly hungry curiosity of people who knew what was coming and wanted to see how the newest victim would break. The waitstaff pressed against the walls had stopped breathing. They'd seen this test before. They knew how it ended. Even the security men at every entrance had tensed, hands drifting unconsciously toward weapons they wouldn't need, because Lenora never required violence to destroy someone. She had other methods. More efficient methods. Methods that left people intact on the outside, while hollowing them out from within. Maribel looked down at the cigarette case. Then she looked at Lenora, and then she did the unthinkable. She calmly bent down, picked up the case, and handed it back directly to Lenora. No scrambling, no apologies, no lowered eyes, or trembling hands, or stammered excuses. She simply picked it up with the same unhurried grace she'd shown every moment since arriving at the estate, and offered it to Lenora as if she were returning a borrowed book to a friend. "You dropped this, ma'am," Maribel said. Her voice was quiet but clear, respectful but not subservient, as if Lenora were a person who deserved dignity, instead of a threat who demanded cowering. The silence in the room changed quality. It became the kind of silence that happens when something impossible occurs. When the laws of physics seem to temporarily suspend themselves. Lenora didn't take the cigarette case immediately. She stood there, staring at Maribel with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something darker. Something almost like recognition, though recognition of what? Even she couldn't quite name. No one had ever done this before. In 5 years of running the Varelli household, Lenora had tested every new employee the same way. She'd drop something valuable, a cigarette case, a piece of jewelry, once even an antique fountain pen worth $15,000, and watch how they responded. Watch them scramble to pick it up. Watch them apologize profusely for something that wasn't their fault. Watch them lower their eyes, and hunch their shoulders, and make themselves small. Watch them learn their place in the hierarchy of fear. Every maid, every server, every groundskeeper, every assistant had passed that test the same way, by demonstrating that they understood exactly how powerless they were, that they knew Lenora could end their employment with a single word, that they feared her. But this woman, this Maribel Knox with her warm skin and her gentle face and her impossibly steady hands, didn't seem to fear anything at all. Lenora's fingers closed around the cigarette case. For a moment, the two women stood face to face, close enough that Maribel could probably smell Lenora's perfume. Something expensive and cold, like money distilled into fragrance. "Thank you," Lenora said finally. Her voice was light, almost pleasant, but everyone who knew her recognized the danger in that pleasantness. "That will be all." Maribel gave a small nod, the kind a professional might give after completing a simple task. Then she turned, and walked back to the serving station along the wall, setting down the coffee pot with the same unhurried precision she'd shown throughout dinner service. She didn't rush. She didn't look relieved to escape. She simply returned to her work, as if nothing unusual had happened. Because to Maribel, apparently, nothing unusual had happened. The room remained frozen for another 3 heartbeats. Then one of the judges cleared his throat and made a comment about the excellent wine selection, and slowly, like ice cracking on a spring river, conversation resumed. But it wasn't the same. The 50 powerful guests kept glancing toward Maribel. The other staff members exchanged looks that held equal parts shock and something that might have been hope. And Lenora stood in the center of it all, still holding her cigarette case, with an expression on her face that no one in this house had seen before. Uncertainty. From his position in the doorway of his private study, a room that connected to the dining hall through a door most guests never noticed, Thatcher Varelli watched it all. He'd been on a business call with associates in New York when he'd heard the quality of silence change in the adjacent room. That particular silence meant something significant was happening. So he'd ended the call and positioned himself where he could observe without being observed, the way he'd learned to do over 30 years of running an organization that required constant vigilance. Thatcher was 52 years old, tall with the kind of imposing frame that made most men uncomfortable even when he was sitting down. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back from his face, revealing heavy-lidded eyes that rarely showed emotion because emotion was a liability in his world. He wore a dark, tailored suit even here in his own home, because power, he'd learned, was as much about appearance as substance. And what he'd just witnessed had been deeply, fundamentally interesting. Lenora had administered her usual test. The new maid had responded in a way no one ever responded. And Lenora, his fiancée, the woman who'd helped him run this organization for the past 8 years, the woman who was supposed to be unshakable, had looked uncertain. Thatcher's eyes moved to the new maid, Maribel Knox. 20-something, hired 2 weeks ago through the third-party agency they used for all household staff. Her file had been unremarkable. Orphaned at 16, foster care system, spotty employment history working various service jobs. The agency had vouched for her references. Everything had checked out. But watching her now, watching the way she moved through the room with that absolute calm, the way the other staff members' eyes followed her instead of Lenora, the way she treated his fiancée with simple dignity instead of fear, Thatcher knew with complete certainty that Maribel Knox was not what she appeared to be. No one who'd grown up in foster care and bounced between service jobs moved with that kind of professional precision. No one who was just a maid asked the kinds of detailed questions about the estate's layout that Maribel had asked the head housekeeper last week. No one who was truly powerless maintained that degree of composure when tested by the most psychologically dangerous woman in the Hudson Valley. Something was wrong with the new maid. Or perhaps, Thatcher thought with a slight tightening around his eyes that might have been the beginning of a smile, something was finally right. Because the fear that had governed his household for years, the fear that Lenora cultivated so carefully, the fear that made the estate run with such efficient silence, had just encountered something it couldn't digest. One person who refused to participate. Across the room, Lenora caught his eye. She gave him the smallest tilt of her head, a signal they'd developed years ago that meant we need to talk privately, and excused herself from the dinner table with the kind of gracious smile that revealed nothing of what she was thinking. Thatcher watched her go, then turned his attention back to Maribel. The young woman was refilling water glasses now, moving around the table with the same unhurried efficiency she'd shown all evening. But as she passed behind one of the judges, a man who owed the syndicate 3 favors and wouldn't meet Thatcher's eyes at family gatherings, Maribel's gaze lifted briefly to the oil painting that hung on the far wall. It was a portrait of Thatcher's father, the man who'd built this organization from a small smuggling operation into a multi-state network. The painting had hung in that exact spot for 40 years, but Maribel wasn't looking at the painting itself. She was looking at the wall behind it. At the almost imperceptible seam where the wallpaper didn't quite match. At the place where, 3 generations ago, someone had installed a safe behind a false panel. A safe that currently held nothing, because Thatcher had moved all valuable documents to a more secure location 6 months ago, when he'd begun his audit. But Maribel didn't know that. She was mapping the house, looking for something, searching. And suddenly, everything Thatcher had been investigating for the past 6 months, all the unauthorized operations he'd discovered, all the offshore accounts that shouldn't exist, all the pieces that didn't quite fit the story Lenora had told him about how she ran the household, suddenly all of that clicked into a pattern. The new maid wasn't here by accident. The question was, what was she looking for? And more importantly, would she find it before Lenora found her? Thatcher stepped back from the doorway, letting the shadows swallow him as he'd learned to do long ago. His heart was beating faster than it had in years, not from fear. He'd long since forgotten how to feel fear in any conventional sense, but from the electric anticipation of watching pieces move on a board that most people didn't even know existed. Something was about to break in his carefully controlled world, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Thatcher Varelli had no idea whether that breaking would destroy everything or save it. He only knew that the new maid with the steady hands and the fearless eyes had just done something no one else had dared to do in 5 years. She'd treated Lenora Vale like a human being, instead of a monster. And in doing so she'd revealed the one truth that fear-based power could never survive. Monsters only have power over people who believe in monsters. Stop believing, and the whole system collapses. Chapter 1. The entire Hudson Valley estate fell into silence. Not because the dinner service had ended, not because someone had dropped a plate or spilled wine, but because Lenora Vale had just done something that made every person in that dining room understand that someone was about to be destroyed. At the center of the private dining room, beneath antique chandeliers that had witnessed 3 generations of syndicate business, Lenora stood perfectly still. Her raven black hair fell straight down her back like a dark waterfall. Her pale skin seemed almost luminous in the candlelight, and her cold gray eyes were fixed on the new maid who'd been hired exactly 2 weeks ago. Maribel Knox stood 3 feet away, a silver coffee pot in her hand, her warm brown skin a stark contrast to the crisp white uniform. Her thick coiled hair was pulled into a loose bun. She had soft features, a gentle face that might belong to a kindergarten teacher, but her eyes held something that didn't match that softness. They held calm. Absolute unshakable calm. And in this house, where fear governed every breath, that calm was dangerous. Lenora's silver cigarette case lay on the Persian rug between them. She dropped it deliberately. Everyone knew she'd dropped it deliberately, because Lenora Vale never did anything by accident. This particular gesture, dropping something valuable at a servant's feet, was a test she'd administered dozens of times over the past 5 years. The 50 guests, seated at the long mahogany table, had all gone quiet. Judges, politicians, business leaders who owed the Varelli syndicate favors. They all watched with slightly hungry curiosity, knowing what was coming and wanting to see how the newest victim would break. The waitstaff pressed against the walls had stopped breathing. They'd seen this test before. They knew how it ended. Even the security men at every entrance had tensed, hands drifting unconsciously toward weapons they wouldn't need, because Lenora never required violence to destroy someone. Maribel looked down at the cigarette case. Then she looked at Lenora, and then she did the unthinkable. She calmly bent down, picked up the case, and handed it back directly to Lenora. No scrambling, no apologizing, no lowered eyes, or trembling hands. She simply picked it up with the same unhurried grace she'd shown every moment since arriving, and offered it to Lenora as if returning a borrowed book to a friend. "You drop this, ma'am," Maribel said. Her voice was quiet but clear, respectful but not subservient, as if Lenora were a person who deserved dignity, instead of a threat, who demanded cowering. The silence changed quality. It became the kind of silence that happens when something impossible occurs. Lenora didn't take the cigarette case immediately. She stood there, staring at Maribel with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something darker. No one had ever done this before. In 5 years of running the Varelli household, Lenora had tested every new employee the same way. Drop something valuable, a cigarette case, jewelry, once an antique fountain pen worth $15,000, and watch how they responded. Watch them scramble. Watch them apologize profusely for something that wasn't their fault. Watch them lower their eyes and make themselves small. Watch them learn their place in the hierarchy of fear. Every employee had passed that test the same way, by demonstrating that they understood exactly how powerless they were, that they knew Lenora could end their employment with a single word, that they feared her. But this woman, this Maribel Knox with her warm skin and gentle face and impossibly steady hands, didn't seem to fear anything at all. Lenora's fingers closed around the cigarette case. For a moment, the two women stood face to face, close enough that Maribel could probably smell Lenora's perfume, something expensive and cold, like money distilled into fragrance. "Thank you," Lenora said finally. Her voice was light, almost pleasant, but everyone who knew her recognized the danger in that pleasantness. "That will be all." Maribel gave a small nod, the kind a professional might give after completing a simple task. Then she turned and walked back to the serving station, setting down the coffee pot with the same unhurried precision she'd shown throughout dinner service. She didn't rush. She didn't look relieved. She simply returned to her work, as if nothing unusual had happened. The room remained frozen for 3 heartbeats. Then one of the judges cleared his throat and made a comment about the excellent wine selection, and slowly, like ice cracking on a spring river, conversation resumed. But it wasn't the same. The 50 guests kept glancing toward Maribel. The other staff members exchanged looks that held equal parts shock and something that might have been hope. And Lenora stood in the center of it all, still holding her cigarette case, with an expression no one in this house had seen before. Uncertainty. From his position in the study doorway, Thatcher Varelli watched it all. He was 52, tall, with an imposing frame that made most men uncomfortable. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, revealing heavy-lidded eyes that rarely showed emotion. He wore a dark tailored suit even at home, because power was as much about appearance as substance. And what he'd just witnessed had been deeply, fundamentally interesting. Lenora had administered her usual test. The new maid had responded in a way no one ever responded. And Lenora, his fiancée, the woman who'd helped run this organization for 8 years, the woman who was supposed to be unshakable, had looked uncertain. Near the service entrance, Garen Holt shifted his weight. The head of estate security was broad-shouldered, heavy-set, with the kind of constantly tense posture that came from 20 years of expecting violence. He'd been watching the exchange with growing unease, and now his hand moved to the radio clipped to his belt, as if he might need to call for backup. Against a maid, who'd done nothing except pick up a cigarette case, Garen caught Thatcher's eye across the room. The security chief's expression held a question. "Do you see this? Do you see how wrong this is?" Thatcher gave the smallest nod. Yes, he saw it. He saw everything. Across the room, Lenora caught his eye. She gave him the smallest tilt of her head, a signal they'd developed years ago that meant we need to talk privately, and excused herself from the dinner table with a gracious smile that revealed nothing. As the guests returned to their conversations and the staff resumed their duties, whispers began to circulate through the house like smoke through walls. "Did you see that?" She didn't even apologize. She looked Miss Vale straight in the eye. "She's going to be gone by morning." Or worse, but beneath those whispers, was something else. Something quieter, but more dangerous. A question that hadn't been asked in this house for 5 years. What if we stopped being afraid? What if we all just stopped? Chapter 2. The impossible tasks began the next morning. At 5:30, before dawn had even touched the Hudson Valley Hills, Lenora appeared in the servants' quarters. She never came to the servants' quarters. That was the first sign that something had shifted in the carefully balanced ecosystem of the estate. Maribel was already awake, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed and lacing her shoes when Lenora's shadow fell across the doorway. The other maids in the shared room froze mid-motion, one with her hairbrush suspended in air, another with her uniform only half-buttoned, because the fiancé of the dawn did not descend into their world unless someone was about to be erased from it. "Maribel," Lenora said, her voice carrying that same dangerous pleasantness from the night before. "I need the third-floor gallery silver polished by 7. All of it. There's a specific technique. Pre-1900 pieces require a different compound than modern ones. I trust you know the difference?" It was an impossible task. The third-floor gallery held over 300 pieces of antique silver. Even knowing the proper techniques, it would take 3 people working at full speed to complete it in 90 minutes. One person had no chance. Everyone in the room knew it was impossible. Everyone waited to see how Maribel would beg for help, or admit defeat before she'd even begun. Maribel stood, smoothed her uniform, and met Lenora's eyes with that same unsettling calm. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have it ready." No protest, no panic. Just quiet acceptance of the impossible. Lenora's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Wonderful, I'll inspect it myself at 7 sharp." By 6:45, the silver gleamed. The other staff found reasons to pass by the third-floor gallery that morning. They watched through doorways as Maribel worked with methodical efficiency, her movements precise and unhurried. She didn't race. She didn't panic. She simply worked, piece after piece, using techniques that suggested professional training, rather than the spotty employment history her file claimed. When Lenora arrived at 7 to inspect, her face went carefully blank. Every piece was perfect. More than perfect. The silver shone like it hadn't in years, and Maribel had even reorganized the display cases in a way that made the collection more visually striking. Acceptable, Lenora said, her voice tight. Then she assigned the next impossible task. By the end of the first week, the pattern had become clear to everyone in the house. Lenora would assign Maribel something designed to break her. Clean the ballroom's crystal chandeliers by hand before the afternoon meeting, all 12 of them, each with over 300 individual crystals. Maribel completed it with time to spare, and showed the other maids a more efficient technique for reaching the upper fixtures. Catalog and reorganize the library's rare book collection, using a system Lenora described only once, in passing, with deliberate vagueness. Maribel produced a categorization system so logical that the estate manager quietly adopted it for the permanent records. Serve tea at a precise temperature, Lenora didn't specify. Maribel asked clarifying questions with such calm professionalism that refusing to answer made Lenora look petty in front of guests. Each task was a trap. Each trap failed to catch anything. And slowly, something unprecedented began to happen in the Varelli household. The other staff members started watching Maribel instead of Lenora. It started with small things. The way Maribel stood when Lenora entered a room, back straight, shoulders relaxed, chin level, not defiant but not cowering either. Just present, taking up exactly the space a human being should take up. By the second week, the younger maids had unconsciously adopted the same posture. When Lenora swept through the morning room, 3 of them stood exactly the way Maribel stood. Not challenging, not afraid. Just there. Lenora noticed. Her eyes narrowed as she observed her staff standing like people instead of furniture, and that night she assigned Maribel double shifts covering for 6 staff members who weren't actually sick. Maribel worked 18 hours without complaint. Without slowing. Without making a single mistake. The kitchen staff started copying the way she asked questions. Respectfully but directly. Forcing clarity rather than accepting vague commands designed to set them up for failure. The groundskeepers noticed how she made eye contact when Lenora spoke to her, and began doing the same. The drivers observed how she never apologized for things that weren't her fault, and stopped their reflexive "sorry ma'am" whenever Lenora passed. Fear was fracturing. Not breaking, not yet, but developing hairline cracks like ice on a warming lake. And everyone could feel it. By the 3rd week, Garen Holt couldn't take it anymore. The head of security found Thatcher in his study going over shipping manifests, and closed the door with more force than was strictly necessary. Garen was a man who'd carried out orders that would give most people nightmares. But right now he looked genuinely unsettled. "We need to talk about the new maid," Garen said without preamble. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. "Something's wrong with her." Thatcher set down his pen and gave Garen his full attention. "Wrong how? She doesn't fear anything." Garen paced to the window, then back. "I've been watching her for 3 weeks. Miss Vale has thrown everything at her. Tasks that should break someone in hours. And she just completes them perfectly. Like it's nothing. Perhaps she's simply competent." "No." Garen shook his head. "It's not competence. It's something else. She's too calm. Too prepared. And the other staff, they're changing. They're watching her instead of Miss Vale. The fear that keeps this house running, He struggled for the words. "It's not working on her. And because it's not working on her, it's starting to not work on anyone else." Thatcher leaned back in his chair, studying his security chief. "You think she's a threat? I think no one acts like this unless they're hiding something. Her background check was clean, but I want to dig deeper. Real deep, because something is off." Garen's hand moved unconsciously toward his hip, where he usually carried a weapon. "People who've worked service jobs their whole lives don't have military precision. They don't organize systems better than trained professionals. They don't stay calm under psychological warfare. What do you propose? Let me investigate properly. Check employment history beyond what the agency provided. See if Maribel Knox is even her real name. Find out what she's really doing here." Garen met Thatcher's eyes. "Because I guarantee you, sir, she's not here to clean silver. She's looking for something." Thatcher was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the late autumn sun was setting over the Hudson Valley, painting the hills in shades of amber and rust. He'd been thinking the same thing for weeks now, watching Maribel move through his house with that unsettling grace. "Investigate," he said finally. "But don't interfere. I want to know what she's looking for. And if she finds it, then we'll discover what kind of threat we're actually dealing with." Thatcher turned back to his manifests, signaling the conversation was over. "And Garen, make sure Miss Vale doesn't know you're investigating. I want to see how this plays out without interference." Garen nodded, though his expression suggested he thought they were making a mistake by waiting. He left, closing the door quietly behind him. Alone in his study, Thatcher steepled his fingers and stared at nothing. Somewhere in this house, a woman who shouldn't exist was systematically dismantling 5 years of fear-based control, just by refusing to participate in it. And the most fascinating part was that she was doing it without saying a single defiant word. She was simply treating everyone, Lenora included, with dignity. As if dignity were a weapon no one had thought to defend against. Chapter 3. Garin Holt had been running security for the Varelli estate for 12 years, which meant he'd developed an instinct for when something was wrong. Not explosive wrong. The kind that announced itself with gunfire and panic. The quiet kind. The kind that looked like normalcy, until you paid attention to the details that didn't add up. Maribel Knox was full of details that didn't add up. He spread the background check across Thatcher's desk, 3 weeks after she'd arrived. Standard procedure for any new hire. But this one had taken longer than usual because the deeper he dug, the less he found. Or rather, the more carefully constructed the absence became. Orphaned at 16, Garin said, pointing to the first page. Parents died in a car accident outside Baton Rouge. Foster care system, aged out at 18. Spotty employment history after that. Retail, food service, housekeeping. Hired through the same third-party agency we've used for years. Thatcher was reviewing quarterly reports, glasses on, the kind of focused attention that meant he was listening, even when he appeared occupied. And she's too good at her job. Garin pulled out his own notes, handwritten, encrypted shorthand that had kept him alive in a profession where mistakes usually weren't survivable. She completes Lenora's impossible tasks, not adequately, perfectly. The silver polishing? 300 years of tarnish removal, using techniques that require professional training. She didn't just clean it. She restored it using methods most housekeeping staff have never heard of. Thatcher set down his pen. That got his attention. The tea service 2 days ago, Garin continued. Lenora demanded it at a specific temperature she deliberately didn't specify. Every other maid we've had either guessed wrong or broke down asking. Maribel asked clarifying questions with such calm precision that refusing to answer made Lenora look petty. She's trained in de-escalation. I've seen it in military personnel, law enforcement. Foster care doesn't teach that. No, it doesn't. Garin flipped to his surveillance notes. And then there's the question she asks while working. Innocent on the surface. How old is this wing of the house? Were these rooms always configured this way? Who used to live in the East Wing before it was converted to storage? But when you map them, he spread out a floor plan of the estate, with marked locations. Red dots showed where Maribel had asked questions. When connected, they formed a systematic grid, covering the entire main house and library. She's mapping the building, Thatcher said quietly, room by room, wing by wing. She's been here 3 weeks, and she knows this estate's layout better than staff who've worked here 5 years. And yesterday, Garin pulled out another document. I caught her in the library during her break. Said she was looking for something to read, but she wasn't browsing. She was examining the architecture, running her hands along the paneling, looking for inconsistencies. Thatcher leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, the posture he took when processing information that required immediate decision-making. What does Lenora think? Lenora thinks she's won. That Maribel's compliance means she's broken, just taking longer to show it. She's so focused on the psychological game that she's missing the operational one. But you're not missing it. No, sir. I'm not. Garin's jaw tightened. Maribel Knox doesn't fear anything. Not Lenora. Not this household. Not the consequences of being caught asking questions she shouldn't be asking. People who don't fear consequences are either stupid or protected. She's not stupid. Protected by whom? That's what I can't figure out. Her background check is too clean. No criminal record, no flags, no connections to law enforcement or intelligence. But someone taught her how to move through hostile environments without triggering alarms. Someone taught her how to ask questions that sound innocent. Someone sent her here. Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that preceded decisions that couldn't be unmade. Outside the study windows, late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds. Somewhere in the house, Maribel was probably folding linens, or polishing doorknobs, or doing whatever tasks Lenora had assigned to test her today. What's your recommendation? Thatcher asked. Remove her. Tonight, before she finds whatever she's looking for. Garin's voice was firm, professional. We don't know what she wants, but we know she's here with purpose. That makes her a threat. To whom? The question hung in the air. Garin hesitated, which was rare for a man who'd made his career out of decisive action in unclear situations. To the household, he said finally. To the operation. To Lenora? Garin met Thatcher's eyes. Yes, sir. Specifically to Lenora. Something about this woman unsettles her in ways I haven't seen before. And when Lenora's unsettled, she makes mistakes. Like testing Maribel publicly at dinner. Yes. Like assigning impossible tasks that Maribel completes perfectly, making Lenora look petty in front of staff. Yes. like becoming so obsessed with breaking one maid that she stopped paying attention to everything else. Garen said nothing. The implication was clear. Thatcher stood, walked to the window. Below, Maribel emerged from the servants' entrance carrying fresh linens toward the guest wing. Her posture was straight, her movements efficient, her expression calm. She looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a competent housekeeper doing her job. "She's looking for something," Thatcher said. It wasn't a question. Yes, something in this house. Something specific enough that she's willing to risk her life to find it. That's my assessment. Thatcher watched Maribel disappear into the building. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, but carried the absolute authority that made men like Garen Holt obey without question for 12 years. "Then let her look." Garen's head snapped up. "Sir? You heard me. Let her look. Let her ask her questions. Let her map the estate. Let her examine the library's architecture." Thatcher turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "But watch what she finds. I want to know what's in my house that's worth infiltrating a crime syndicate to locate. And if she finds it, if whatever she's looking for is damaging, incriminating, dangerous," Thatcher's smile was thin, "then I want to know that too. Because if someone buried something in my estate, if someone used my household to hide evidence or leverage or secrets, then I have a problem that's bigger than one well-trained maid asking innocent questions." He returned to his desk, picked up his pen, resumed his quarterly reports as if the conversation was over. But Garen knew better than to leave without explicit dismissal. "How closely do you want her monitored?" he asked. "Closely enough to see what she finds. Not so closely that you interfere with her finding it." Thatcher's pen moved across the page, signing off on something that probably moved millions of dollars between accounts. "And Garen, make sure Lenora doesn't harm her. Whatever Maribel's looking for, I want her to find it intact. And I want to know what it is before anyone else does." "Understood." Garen gathered his files, headed for the door. Thatcher's voice stopped him at the threshold. "One more thing. The accident that killed her parents 10 years ago. Outside Baton Rouge. Look into it." "Why?" Thatcher didn't look up from his reports. "Because people don't spend a decade building false identities to infiltrate estates over random tragedies. They do it over murders. And if someone was murdered, and the evidence is hidden in my house, I need to know whose murder it was." The door closed. Garen disappeared into the hallway, and Thatcher sat alone in his study, signing financial documents while thinking about a maid who didn't fear his fiancée and the ghost of a car accident that might not have been an accident at all. Chapter 4. The library occupied the entire east wing of the estate. 3 stories of mahogany shelving and leather-bound volumes that smelled like old money and older secrets. Maribel had been mapping it for 2 weeks, room by room, using her morning cleaning duties as cover for the kind of systematic search that would have made her father proud. "Look where we used to read together." His last words to her before that final drive. Before the brake lines failed on a straight stretch of highway, and their car became a coffin for 2 people and a 16-year-old's understanding of justice. She'd survived with a concussion, and enough memory loss that the investigators had called it mercy. But she remembered those words. Remembered her father's hand squeezing hers. Remembered the way he'd said together like it was a place, not just a shared activity. The estate library, where federal prosecutor Marcus Hartley had spent 3 months during his investigation, reviewing documents with Thatcher Varelli's grudging cooperation, building the money laundering case that would have destroyed the syndicate if he'd lived long enough to testify. Maribel worked the upper gallery that morning, dusting shelves that probably hadn't been touched in years. The main floor below was empty. Lenora preferred the morning room for her correspondence, and Thatcher was in the city for meetings. Garen's security detail rotated through every 40 minutes, predictable as clockwork. She had 35 minutes before the next sweep. Her fingers traced the paneling between 2 bookcases. The wood grain didn't quite match. Not obvious unless you were looking for inconsistencies. But she'd spent 8 years working evidence processing for the district attorney's office, learning to see what didn't belong. The seam was too clean, the trim too uniform. And when she pressed lightly at the corner, something clicked. The panel swung inward on oiled hinges that shouldn't have been oiled in a section of library that was supposedly abandoned storage. Someone had been here recently. Someone who knew what was hidden and wanted to access it without the noise of a rusted mechanism giving them away. The space behind the panel was narrow, maybe 2 feet deep, carved into the wall cavity between the library and the servants' stairwell. Inside, a metal document box, the kind lawyers used for original contracts and sealed depositions. No lock, just a simple clasp that opened when she lifted it. Inside were files, legal documents with county clerk stamps, bank records with offshore account numbers, witness statements on official letterhead, and a handwritten note on her father's stationery, dated 3 days before his death. "If you're reading this, they got me. Everything you need is here. Bank transfers, showing money laundering through shell companies. Testimony from 3 syndicate members who flipped. Communications between LV and GH, discussing, quote, the Hartley problem, and, quote, permanent solutions. Maintenance records from Precision Auto showing brake lines on my vehicle were professionally compromised. I've sealed copies with the county clerk under emergency protective order. They'll hold for 20 years, or until my daughter claims them. Maribel, if you find this, know that I tried. And know that not everyone in that house is guilty. Some of them don't know what's happening in their name. Dad. Her hands were shaking. 10 years of wondering if she'd imagined the conversation about hidden evidence. 10 years of therapy telling her that trauma created false memories, that grief invented conspiracies where there were only accidents. 10 years of being told her father died because of faulty brakes, not because someone cut them. She pulled out the maintenance records. Precision Auto Service, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Date of service, 3 days before the crash. Work order signed by the shop manager noting, customer brake lines show evidence of clean cuts consistent with professional tools, not wear. Customer advised to file police report. Customer declined, said he'd handle it through federal channels. Her father had known, had documented it, had sealed the evidence and hidden it in the one place he thought they wouldn't look, inside the estate he'd been investigating, in the library where he'd spent months reading financial records that Marcus Hartley had every legitimate reason to access. The communications between LV and GH were printed emails, the kind that should have been encrypted but someone had been careless or overconfident. From L.Vale at Varelli-Enterprises.com to G.Holt at Varelli-Security.com. Date, 10 years ago. Subject, risk management. The Hartley problem needs permanent solution. He's scheduled to testify in 6 days. Federal protection starts in 4. Window is closing. Handle it quietly. Make it look like an accident. I don't care how. Brake failure, gas leak, whatever reads as mechanical. Just make sure there's no federal investigation afterward. Budget is unlimited. Confirmation required within 48 hours. Lenora Vale, Garen Holt, the fiancé and the head of security, not Thatcher. The Don's name appeared nowhere in the communications, nowhere in the planning, nowhere in the execution order that killed her parents, and derailed a federal case that would have sent half the syndicate to prison. Maribel was still staring at the documents when she heard footsteps on the gallery stairs. Not the heavy tread of security. Something lighter, measured, the kind of walk that announced presence without threatening it. Thatcher appeared at the top of the stairs, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He looked at the open panel, at the document box, at the papers in her hands, at her face, which had probably gone through 6 different emotions in the 3 seconds since she'd realized she wasn't alone. You found it, he said quietly. Not a question, not surprise, just confirmation of something he'd been expecting. Maribel's training kicked in. Assess threat. Identify exits, calculate odds of reaching the servant's stairwell before he could stop her. But she didn't run. Because running meant leaving the evidence, and the evidence was the only thing that mattered. How long have you known? Her voice was steadier than she felt. That the documents were here? 3 months. I found them during an estate inventory, after we discovered structural issues in the east wing. Had the paneling open to check for water damage, and found your father's insurance policy instead. He moved closer, not threatening, just closing the distance to conversation range. That Lenora ordered your parents killed? 6 months. When I conducted a financial audit and discovered unauthorized offshore accounts, shadow operations, communications I never saw. She'd been running a parallel organization without my knowledge or approval. And you did nothing. I did everything. His voice was cold with the kind of anger that had been building for months. I contacted federal investigators, negotiated an immunity deal, spent 6 months transferring assets, documenting crimes, building a case that will dismantle this entire operation. I've been waiting for the right moment and the right witness. Someone who has standing to testify. Someone who can't be accused of fabricating evidence for an immunity deal. He gestured to the documents in her hands. Someone like Marcus Hartley's daughter, who found sealed evidence her father hid before his murder. Evidence that corroborates everything I've been telling federal prosecutors for 6 months. Evidence that proves Lenora operated without my authorization and killed to cover her tracks. Maribel stared at him. At the Don, who was supposed to be the villain of this story but was somehow offering her exactly what she'd spent 10 years searching for. Validation, corroboration, and a path to justice that didn't end with her body in the Hudson River. Why should I trust you? Because, Thatcher said, pulling out his phone and showing her an encrypted message thread with federal prosecutors. I've already given them everything else. All I needed was your father's sealed documents to complete the case. And I needed you to find them yourself so no one could claim I planted evidence. The gallery was quiet, except for the distant sound of the main floor grandfather clock marking time neither of them was paying attention to anymore. Lenora doesn't know you found them, Thatcher said. And she won't. Not until the moment we want her to know. Not until we have federal agents surrounding this estate, and no way for her to destroy what you're holding. Maribel looked at the documents, at her father's handwriting, at the evidence that proved every instinct she'd had for 10 years was right. When? She asked. 2 weeks. There's a dinner scheduled with 75 witnesses. Judges, politicians, business leaders who owe the syndicate favors. Lenora will be performing for her audience, and that's when we'll give her the one thing she's feared for a decade. A public reckoning she can't control. He turned to leave, paused at the stairs. And Maribel? Keep working. Keep completing her impossible tasks. Keep treating her with dignity. Because every day you don't break is another day she reveals herself. And we need her to be revealed completely before this ends. The footsteps descended. The gallery emptied. And Maribel stood alone with her father's final gift, realizing that sometimes justice delayed wasn't justice denied. It was justice waiting for the right moment to be absolutely certain. Chapter 5. The dining room held 75 of the most influential people in the Northeastern Corridor. Federal judges who'd issued favorable rulings, state senators who'd killed oversight bills, CEOs whose companies had benefited from syndicate connections they pretended not to notice. They sat beneath crystal chandeliers that cost more than most of them made in a year, drinking wine that had been aged longer than some of their marriages, pretending this was a social dinner and not a demonstration of power. Lenora presided from Thatcher's right diamond necklace catching light with every breath, her cold smile fixed in place like armor. She'd been planning this moment for 2 weeks, ever since Garin had finally tracked down Maribel's real identity through a sealed witness protection file that had cost $30,000 to access through a corrupt federal clerk. Maribel Knox Hartley, daughter of Marcus Hartley, the federal prosecutor who died so conveniently 10 years ago. Lenora had spent those 2 weeks deciding exactly how to destroy her. Publicly, completely, in front of an audience that would spread the story through every corridor of power she needed to maintain control over. Maribel was serving coffee at the far end of the room, same calm efficiency she'd shown for 8 weeks, when Lenora stood and tapped her wineglass with a silver knife. The sound cut through conversation like a blade through silk. All 75 guests fell silent. "I have an announcement," Lenora said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who'd learned. "Now you've come here on some revenge fantasy? How pathetic." "It's not a fantasy," Maribel said, opening the envelope. "My father sealed evidence with the county clerk 3 days before his death. Insurance in case of his murder. He hid the original documents in this estate, in the library where he'd spent 3 months during his investigation. I found them 6 weeks ago." She spread papers across the dining table where 75 witnesses could see. Bank account ledgers. Witness statements. Communications between email accounts that guests were already recognizing. "These are printed emails between Lenora Vale and Garin Holt," Maribel said, pointing to the relevant sections. "Discussing the Hartley problem. Discussing, quote, permanent solutions. Discussing how to make a federal prosecutor's murder look like mechanical failure." A federal judge in the front row leaned forward, reading the email headers, the timestamps, the account signatures that were going to be very difficult to explain away. "And these," Maribel continued, "are maintenance records from the auto shop that serviced my parents' car 3 days before the crash. The mechanic documented that brake lines showed evidence of professional cuts, not wear. He advised my father to file a police report. My father said he'd handle it through federal channels." She looked directly at Lenora, whose smile had started to fracture around the edges. "He documented everything. He sealed it with the county clerk. And he told me where to find it if something happened to him. Look where we used to read together," he said. "I was 16. I didn't understand, but 10 years later, I finally did." Lenora's face had gone white, but she recovered with the speed of someone who'd spent years controlling narratives. "These could be fabricated. Forged. There's no proof. Where did you get those documents?" The question came out sharp, desperate. "Those were destroyed." She stopped. The room went absolutely silent. Lenora had just admitted she knew about documents that were supposedly fabricated, had just revealed knowledge of evidence she should have had no reason to recognize, if the deaths had actually been accidental. A state senator in the third row was already recording on his phone. A CEO near the windows had her hand over her mouth. And Thatcher, who'd been sitting at the head of the table watching this entire performance, with the expression of a man conducting an orchestra, finally stood. "I know," he said quietly. All eyes turned to him. "I've known for 6 months, Thatcher continued, his voice carrying the absolute authority that made rooms full of powerful people fall silent. "When I conducted an audit of syndicate finances, I discovered unauthorized operations that Lenora had been running. I discovered she'd killed a federal prosecutor without my approval or knowledge. I discovered she'd been operating a shadow network I never sanctioned." He looked at Lenora, and there was no warmth in his expression. No partnership. Just cold assessment. "And I've spent 6 months dismantling it." transferring assets, cooperating with federal investigators, building a case for immunity that requires one thing: a witness who can't be accused of fabricating evidence for a deal. He gestured to Maribel, someone like Marcus Hartley's daughter, who found sealed evidence her father hid before his murder. Evidence that corroborates everything I've been telling prosecutors. Evidence that proves Lenora Vale operated without authorization and killed to protect operations I never approved. Lenora's face had drained of all color. You wouldn't. You can't. I already have. Thatcher looked toward the windows. Outside, red and blue lights flashed through the trees. Federal vehicles surrounding the estate, moving into position, with the precision of an operation that had been planned for months. Agents are here for you, Lenora. And for Guerin. And for the 12 other senior members who participated in the Hartley operation. Thatcher's voice was ice. You made a fatal mistake 10 years ago. You killed a prosecutor without my authorization, created a liability I've been managing ever since. He moved closer to her, close enough that the 75 witnesses could hear every word. And you made a worse mistake 8 weeks ago. You let fear control you. When Maribel didn't fear you, you became obsessed. You tested her. You revealed yourself. You proved that your entire system of control was built on nothing more than the ability to make people afraid. The dining room doors opened. Federal agents in tactical gear moved in with the efficiency of people who'd rehearsed this arrest a dozen times. Lead agent approached Lenora with handcuffs already out. Lenora Vale, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering and obstruction of justice. Lenora screamed as they pulled her arms behind her back. You can't do this. I built this organization with you. I protected you. Thatcher's response was barely audible over her protests. You killed innocent people without my knowledge. You made us vulnerable to federal prosecution. You ruled through fear instead of loyalty. And when someone finally didn't fear you, your entire system collapsed. As they led her toward the door, Lenora looked back at Maribel with pure hatred burning in her eyes. You destroyed everything. Maribel's response was calm, as it had been for 8 weeks. Calm as it had been when she'd picked up that cigarette case on her first night. Calm as the daughter of a federal prosecutor, who'd taught her that justice sometimes took time but was always worth pursuing. No, she said. You destroyed my family. I just made sure everyone finally knew the truth. The doors closed. The agents disappeared with their prisoner, and 75 witnesses sat in stunned silence, realizing they'd just watched a crime syndicate dismantle itself from within, because one woman had refused to be afraid. Chapter 6. The first thing Thatcher did was stop moving. The room was still erupting. Guests pushing back from the table, voices crashing into one another, Lenora's composure fracturing for the first time anyone present could remember. But Thatcher had gone perfectly still. The way a man goes still when something he has been waiting for finally arrives, exactly where he arranged it. He raised one hand. The silence that followed was not the stunned silence of the cigarette case moment weeks before. This was different. This was the silence of 75 people who understood what was about to happen, and knew there was nothing left to do about it. Thatcher looked at Lenora, held her gaze without anger, without satisfaction. The look of a man closing an account that had been overdrawn for years. I know, he said. Quiet. Almost gentle. But the words landed like a door being sealed. He told them what he had found 6 months prior. The unauthorized accounts. The shadow operations Lenora had built beneath the syndicate without his knowledge. The Hartley murders. How Guerin carried them out on her direct instruction. How the brake lines were cut with professional precision. How all of it had been kept from him. He told them he had spent those 6 months doing what he always did when confronted with a liability. He managed it, quietly. Then he told them about the immunity deal. The word moved through the room like a current. In a space full of people who had spent decades learning exactly what federal prosecution cost, it carried its own gravity. A state senator near the end of the table went pale. A judge set down his wine glass with exaggerated care. The arrangement has been in place for 3 months, Thatcher said. Not to the room. To Lenora. The agents have been briefed. They have been listening. Lenora did not scream. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she could not immediately control, searching for the angle she had missed. There was no angle. That was the point. You wouldn't do this. I already have. The windows had been dark since evening. But now red and blue light began moving across the glass, faint at first, then spreading, vehicle after vehicle until the grounds were painted in it. Maribel watched the light and felt something in her chest finally come to rest. Not triumph, something smaller and older, something that had been waiting a very long time. The agents came through the service entrance. The same door the kitchen staff used every morning. They moved without hurry, a practiced ease that confirmed this had been choreographed long before tonight. The lead agent approached Thatcher. A few words. Low. A nod. Then she turned. Lenora Vale and Garen Holt were arrested in the dining room, beneath the chandeliers, in front of all 75 guests. The charges were read plainly. Murder. Conspiracy. Racketeering. Garen did not resist. He had read the room the moment Maribel spread the documents, and understood the only negotiation left was how much of his life he could salvage. He would cooperate. He would testify. Lenora fought. Not physically, she was too precise for that, but she turned, one final time, to the room she had governed through fear for years and opened her mouth. Something sharp, something to remind them what she had protected, what she had built. The room was not looking at her. They were looking at Maribel, at the woman who had come into this house as a maid and had not raised her voice once, had not given fear a single foothold, who stood now with her hands at her sides and her back straight, and that same quiet steadiness she had carried since the very first night, since she bent down and picked up a silver cigarette case and handed it back to the most dangerous woman in the room, as though she were simply a person. Lenora's mouth closed. Thatcher addressed the guests last. The syndicate was being dissolved. The legitimate businesses would continue under new ownership. Every illegal operation ended tonight. Those with past dealings were being offered immunity in exchange for testimony. The federal government wanted the people at the center, not the edges. Most of them would take it. The alternative had just been made clear. The room emptied slowly after that. Quietly, the way water drains, and the staff, gathering near the kitchen door, watched the space where Lenora had stood. The air there was different now. When they looked at each other, really looked for the first time in years, none of them flinched. Chapter 7. 6 months after Hurricane Ophelia dismantled the Hale Estate's carefully manicured gardens and Cormac's carefully controlled life, the federal courthouse in Savannah looked like a fortress under siege. News vans lined every curb. Reporters jostled for position on the steps. The trial of Lenora Vale and Garen Holt had captivated the nation, not just for the murders of Marcus and Elena Hartley 10 years ago, but for the web of corruption that unraveled when one woman refused to be afraid. Elowen sat in the gallery's front row, Cormac beside her, Breyer between them, working on a coloring book while lawyers made closing arguments. Dr. Okoye had approved his presence for the verdict. He deserves to see that justice is possible, even when it's slow. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they filed back in, Elowen found Maribel's hand across the aisle, the maid-turned-investigator who'd exposed everything, who'd spent 6 weeks searching the estate while maintaining perfect service, who'd looked Lenora in the eye and refused to flinch. On the charge of murder, in the first degree in the death of Marcus Hartley, we find the defendant Lenora Vale. Guilty. Maribel's grip tightened. Elowen squeezed back. On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Elena Hartley, we find the defendant Lenora Vale. Guilty. Lenora's face remained porcelain, perfect, but her hands, those manicured hands that had orchestrated so much suffering, trembled slightly as bailiffs approached. On all charges of conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice, guilty. The judge's sentencing was swift. Life without possibility of parole. 2 consecutive life sentences. Lenora would die in prison, her psychological empire reduced to a 6x8 cell where fear had no currency. As they led her away, she looked directly at Maribel, one final time, not with hatred, with confusion, as if she still couldn't understand how someone had simply refused to be controlled. Garen Holt's trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier. He'd turned state's evidence, testified against Lenora in exchange for a plea deal. 20 years. Eligible for parole in 15 if he continued cooperating. The man who'd cut brake lines that killed a prosecutor and his wife would be 70 before he saw freedom again, if the prison system allowed it. Is it over? Breyer asked when they emerged into February sunlight. The trial is, Cormac said. He'd testified too, about discovering the truth, about choosing to dismantle rather than defend, about learning that control over an empire meant nothing if you controlled it toward evil. But healing takes longer than verdicts. They drove to Bonaventure Cemetery in silence. Elowen, Cormac, Breyer, and Maribel. The historic graveyard overlooked the Wilmington River, live oaks draped in Spanish moss, creating cathedral spaces between monuments to Savannah's dead. Marcus and Elena Hartley were buried in the newer section, under a simple stone Maribel had chosen years ago with money she didn't have. Beloved parents, seekers of truth, gone but never forgotten. She'd visited maybe 3 times in 10 years. Each time the grief was too raw, too angry, too bound up with injustice, to allow actual mourning. You can't grieve properly when the people who killed your parents are still free, still powerful, still protected by the same system your father died trying to reform. But today was different. Maribel knelt in the grass, placed fresh flowers on the grave, her father's favorite, sunflowers that turned toward light even in darkness. I kept my promise, Dad. Her voice was steady, cleansed by tears shed in a courtroom when justice finally arrived. I found what you hid. I made sure everyone knew the truth. Lenora Vale will never hurt anyone again. She touched the stone, fingers tracing her mother's name. Mom, I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry I spent 10 years being angry, instead of remembering how you laughed. How you made Dad's favorite lemon cake every Sunday. How you called me your little warrior, when I scraped my knees and kept playing. Briar approached quietly, set his toy compass beside the flowers. My mama's in heaven too, he said. Iloan says they can see us from there. Maybe your mama and my mama are friends now. Maribel pulled him into a hug. This child who'd taught her that survival wasn't the opposite of grief. It was the container that held it, until you were strong enough to feel everything, and keep breathing. Maybe they are, she whispered. Iloan and Cormac stood back, giving space. They'd learned something in 6 months of legal proceedings, custody resolutions and rebuilding, that justice and healing weren't the same thing. Justice was what courts delivered. Healing was what you chose every day after. Cormac had dissolved Hale Logistics' illegal operations entirely, restructured as legitimate enterprises under federal oversight. He'd entered a witness protection program he could leave, no new identity required, just relocation and security until the appeals process ended. He'd chosen to stay in Savannah anyway. Running didn't save Margot from her demons. It won't save me from mine. Better to face them here. Sylvie and Devereaux had attended the trial every day, sitting behind Cormac in a silent truce born of Briar's chamber testimony. Grandma was sad. But being sad doesn't make you right about everything. She'd withdrawn the custody petition, agreed to regular visitation, even attended the small ceremony where Cormac and Iloan had quietly married at the courthouse. Briar as ringbearer, Patty as witness, no press, no spectacle, just promises made and meant. Dr. Okoye's final evaluation had been unequivocal. Briar Hale is thriving. Secure attachment to both parents. Age-appropriate grief processing. Remarkable emotional intelligence for a 6-year-old. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. What they were doing was simple. Choosing each other. Every morning. Every crisis. Every moment when control seemed safer than trust. As the sun lowered over Bonaventure's ancient oaks, casting long shadows across graves of people who'd sought truth and paid for it, Maribel stood. Thank you, she said to Cormac and Iloan, for testifying, for letting me hide in your chaos while I searched, for understanding that some fights take a decade but still deserve fighting. Thank you, Cormac replied, for showing us that fear only works on people who believe it's inevitable. You taught my household staff. Hell, you taught me that calm dignity is stronger than any threat. Briar retrieved his compass, studied it seriously. My mama said this helps you find home. I think maybe home isn't a place. I think it's people who help you be brave when everything's scary. Then you found your way home, buddy, Maribel said. They walked back to the car as evening settled over Savannah, a city built on cotton wealth and slave labor, on secrets buried in beautiful gardens, on the lie that elegance could hide evil if you controlled who got to speak. But truth was patient. Truth waited for daughters who refused to forget, for sons who asked their dead mothers permission to love again, for women who treated monsters like humans, and discovered monsters only had power when humans played along, for men who finally understood that building an empire on fear meant living in one. Lenora Vale would spend the rest of her life in prison, learning what it felt like to be powerless. Garen Holt would spend 20 years understanding that loyalty to evil wasn't loyalty at all. And Thatcher Varelli, whose syndicate had ordered hits and laundered money and corrupted officials for generations, had chosen something harder than running or fighting, dismantling his own kingdom, brick by careful brick, until nothing remained except the chance to build something clean. In the Hale family car, Briar fell asleep against Eloan's shoulder, compass clutched in his hand. Cormac drove through twilight streets where hurricane damage was still being repaired, roofs replaced, trees replanted, gardens rebuilt. Do you think it was worth it? Eloan asked quietly. Everything we lost to get here? Cormac thought about his estate, underwater for 3 days before the surge receded. About his wife's grave, which they'd had to repair after the storm. About the controlled life he'd spent 20 years perfecting, that had shattered in one hurricane, and one custody battle, and one realization that love required letting go. We didn't lose everything, he said. We lost the things that were already broken. Control. Fear. The illusion that we could manage pain instead of sharing it. He reached for her hand. What we found was worth every loss. Even the ones that still hurt. Maribel, following in her own car, drove to the apartment she'd rented with money from a book deal. Her father's story, told properly, published with all proceeds going to the Marcus Hartley Memorial Fund for federal prosecutors' families. She unpacked groceries, made dinner, called her grandmother in witness protection to say the trial was finally over. Your daddy would be so proud, her grandmother said, crying the way she'd cried every day since the verdict. I know, Nana. I hope Mama is too. That night, for the first time in 10 years, Maribel slept without dreaming of break lines, or courtroom failures, or justice delayed so long it felt like denial. She slept like someone who'd carried an impossible weight for a decade, and finally set it down. Not because the weight disappeared, but because she'd proven it could be carried. And more importantly, that it deserved to be. Truth didn't heal everything, but it made healing possible. And sometimes, that was enough. 6 months after the night fear finally lost its grip on the Hudson Valley estate, the truth stood where silence once ruled. Lenora Vale was sentenced to life without parole. Garen Holt, stripped of his authority and illusions of loyalty, accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for the truth he had hidden for a decade. The syndicate that once thrived on intimidation dissolved quietly, its power undone not by violence, but by exposure. Thatcher Varelli vanished into witness protection, his empire dismantled by his own hand. For the first time in years, the estate stood empty, not haunted by fear, but by accountability. And Maribel Knox Hartley stood alone at her parents' graves. No press, no cameras, no applause, just a daughter who had finally kept her promise. She didn't feel triumph. She felt something rarer. Peace. The kind that only comes when the truth is spoken out loud and heard by the world. Fear had ruled that estate for years, but it only took one person who refused to bow to end it. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is stand calmly where fear expects you to kneel. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video. It really helps the channel reach more people. Comment below and tell us. Right finger. What moment hit you the hardest? Right finger. Was it Maribel's calm defiance, or the truth finally coming out? Share this story with someone who believes courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And if you enjoy powerful stories about hidden strength, justice, and unexpected courage, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Because the next story might change the way you see power forever.